Birmingham, Alabama, 1927. Sunday nights in the South were supposed to belong to peace, to hymns rising from the church windows, to the sound of families walking home under the dim street lamps, to the kind of silence that only comes when people believe they're safe. But in the Birmingham of 1927, safety was a fragile illusion for the black community. The Ku Klux Klan didn't just haunt the back roads, it ruled the city from the shadows. They burned crosses, planted bombs, and called it God's work. On a warm June night, at Mount Olive Baptist Church, a congregation of 60 gathered for evening worship. The pastor, Reverend Isaiah Carter, was a tall, gentle man with a deep voice that could steady a trembling heart. His sermons were known across the county, not for anger but for hope. "We will not answer hate with hate," he would say. "We will answer it with faith, and if faith must burn, then let it burn bright." Those words had kept his people standing through every insult, every threat. But on that night, those words would be tested in fire. When the sun fell and the hymn began, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah," no one saw the trucks rolling silently down the dirt road. Inside them were men in white robes and hoods, carrying torches, chains, and jugs of kerosene. The Klan had come for the church, not to frighten this time, but to erase it. They believed fear could destroy faith. What they didn't know was that this night, Mount Olive was not just a building, it was a battleground. And what waited for them inside wasn't weakness. It was a fire they could never put out. That evening began like any other. The air was heavy with the sweet smell of magnolia and wood smoke, and the sound of crickets filled the narrow streets of the black district known as Southside Hollow. The members of Mount Olive Baptist came slowly, in wagons and on foot, dressed in their Sunday best. Mothers in pressed cotton dresses held their children by the hand. Men carried worn Bibles under their arms, the leather edges soft from years of use. The church was small, made of hand-cut pine and painted white, sitting at the edge of a hill where it caught every bit of sunset light. Inside, oil lamps flickered against the walls, and the wooden pews creaked as people settled in, their laughter mingling with the sound of the choir warming up. Reverend Isaiah stood at the pulpit, a tall silhouette framed by the open door behind him. He wiped his brow with a cloth and smiled at the sight of his people, farmers, maids, veterans from the Great War, and children who knew the rhythm of hymns better than their own names. The Great Depression had not yet hit, but hunger already lived in many homes. Yet on Sunday nights, none of that seemed to matter. The church was the heartbeat of the community, a place where they could breathe freely, sing loudly, and remind one another that they were still human in a world that tried daily to make them forget it. But beneath that joy lay something unspoken. Everyone knew about the Klan meetings that had started again on the outskirts of town. 2 weeks earlier, a black man named Henry Sims had been dragged from his home and beaten for speaking too boldly at the market. His wife still came to church every Sunday, her eyes dark with quiet pain. And yet they still came, every one of them. They came because faith was the only weapon they had, and the only one the Klan couldn't steal. That night, as the choir began its opening hymn, a few of the older men glanced at the windows, as if listening for something beyond the music. Out in the distance, unseen but felt, the wind shifted. The storm had begun to move toward them. Miles away, down a dirt road that wound through the pines, the Klan was gathering. A dozen men, maybe more, stood in a clearing lit only by the glow of lanterns and the red tips of their cigarettes. They spoke in low voices, the kind that carried more venom than sound. Some were drunk, their words slurred, their laughter hollow. Others were quiet, men who wore the robe not for thrill, but for habit, for hate passed down like an heirloom. Their leader, Earl Jennings, a failed merchant with too much pride and too little purpose, paced before them with a shotgun resting on his shoulder. "They've been getting too loud again," he muttered, his voice coarse. That preacher, Carter, he's been filling their heads with ideas, talking about justice, talking about God hearing them. That ain't right, not here. The others nodded, muttering agreement. Jennings continued. They think that little church gives them power. We'll show 'em who holds the power in Birmingham. He pointed the barrel of his gun toward the east. We go tonight. No warning, no cross. We burn it to the ground while they're singing. A few of the men hesitated, not out of mercy, but fear. One of them, younger than the rest, asked softly, "What about the women and kids, Earl?" Jennings shot him a look so cold it cut through the humid air. "They should have stayed home," he said. "If they want to pray, let 'em pray for rain to put out the fire." There were no more questions after that. They loaded the trucks with kerosene cans, chains, and torches. The forest was alive with the hum of cicadas, the smell of damp pine needles and tobacco smoke. As they climbed into the vehicles, one man muttered a nervous prayer, not for forgiveness, but for protection from the vengeance of the God they were about to insult. The engines roared to life, breaking the quiet of the woods. Headlights cut through the darkness as they rolled toward Southside Hollow, toward a hill crowned by a small white church filled with song. The Klan always counted on fear to do most of their work for them. But tonight, something waited on that hill, something they didn't believe in and couldn't understand. And, as they drove closer, the sound of distant hymns began to rise through the trees, strong and unwavering, as if the night itself was singing back at them. Inside Mount Olive, the music swelled with a kind of quiet power that could shake the soul. The choir sang, their voices rolling through the wooden beams, rising into the night like a prayer too strong for walls. The congregation clapped in rhythm, stomping their feet softly on the floorboards, the sound blending into a heartbeat. Reverend Isaiah Carter stood at the pulpit, his Bible open to the book of Psalms. His eyes closed as he spoke. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." His voice was steady, even as a small tremor in the ground, the faintest vibration, made the lantern flames flicker. Near the back of the church, Deacon Ellis, a war veteran with a limp and a revolver hidden under his coat, felt the vibration too. He turned his head, frowning toward the window. Through the small panes, the world outside looked still, too still. The cicadas had stopped their song, and in Alabama, that silence was never a good sign. He rose quietly and stepped outside, the night air thick and damp against his skin. The road that led up the hill was empty, but far off, between the trees, he caught a glint of light, a lantern swinging, then another, and another. His heart sank. He didn't need to count them to know what it meant. He'd seen those lights before, in France during the war, when men came for you in the dark. But this time they weren't soldiers. They were devils, wearing hoods. He turned back to the doorway, his voice low but urgent. "Reverend," he said, "they're coming." The word rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. Mothers pulled their children close. Fathers rose from the pews. But Isaiah didn't panic. He lifted his hands and said, "Keep your seats." His calmness was so sure that it stilled them for a moment. "We knew this day would come. We knew faith would be tested. So tonight we will not run. We will stand." Some began to cry, others whispered prayers, the fear heavy but contained. Deacon Ellis came back inside, locking the doors and moving to the window. "They got fire, Reverend," he said quietly. "Then we got water," Isaiah replied, pointing toward the baptism barrel near the altar. "And we got faith." He looked out over his people, his face illuminated by lamplight, and said, "The words that would define the night. They can burn our church, but they can't touch our spirit. When they come, we meet 'em with faith and fire." The trucks rolled to a stop at the bottom of the hill, their engines cutting out one by one until only the crickets and the distant hum of voices from inside the church could be heard. The men in white robes climbed down, boots crunching over gravel, their breath visible in the cool night air. Earl Jennings stood in front, his hood pulled low, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The road sloped upward, ending in that little white building glowing faintly against the darkness. For a brief moment he hesitated, the sound of singing, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah," floated down the hill. It wasn't loud, but it was strong, steady, and carried something he didn't expect: peace. He spat on the ground, breaking the spell. "Light it up," he barked. One man uncapped a can of kerosene and began to pour, the liquid sloshing over the grass, catching the moonlight like oil on water. Another struck a match, the sulfur burning his nostrils before the flame caught. The torches came alive one by one, orange light flickering off their robes. They started up the hill in formation, the line of fire moving like a serpent toward the house of worship. At the top, Deacon Ellis could see them now, small dots of fire in the distance, multiplying. He turned to the Reverend, his jaw tight. "It's time." Isaiah nodded slowly, setting his Bible down on the pulpit. "Lock the windows," he told the deacons. "Douse the steps." The women moved quickly, their fear transformed into purpose. Buckets of water were poured down the stairs, the air filling with the sharp scent of wet wood and kerosene. As the clan neared the churchyard, their laughter grew louder. They shouted things meant to wound. "Come on out, let's see if your Jesus saves you now." A few rocks hit the outer wall, thudding like fists. Inside, the congregation gripped hands. Reverend Isaiah stepped to the front doors, his eyes fixed on the advancing mob. His voice was low, but every ear heard him. "Don't answer them," he said. "Answer God." Then he lifted his head and began to sing, alone at first, his deep baritone carrying through the door. "Swing low, sweet chariot." Within seconds, others joined. Then the entire church. Their voices rose as one, a wall of sound meeting the wall of hate climbing toward them. Earl Jennings stopped halfway up the hill, unnerved. The singing wasn't fear, it was defiance. "Shut 'em up," he snarled, motioning forward. The first torch arced through the night and struck the steps, sputtering out against the wet wood. Another landed by the window, smoke curling upward. Inside, the people kept singing. The fire refused to take. Frustrated, one man pushed forward with his own torch and slammed it against the door. But as he did, the wood burst outward, a torrent of water dousing him head to toe. He fell back, cursing, his torch snuffed. The congregation didn't cheer, they simply sang louder. On the hill, the men of the clan stood drenched and trembling, their flames faltering in the face of a faith that refused to die. For a moment both worlds stood still, the mob outside, humiliated and seething, and the congregation within, breathing hard through their hymns. The smell of kerosene mingled with damp wood and candle smoke. Earl Jennings ripped off his hood, his face red and glistening with sweat. "Enough!" he bellowed, kicking the soaked man at his feet. "You burn it from the sides." The others hesitated, their torches sputtering in the wet air. But they obeyed. They fanned out around the church, pouring the last of the fuel along the foundation. The night hissed as fire met water, as flames fought for purchase on slick pine boards. The orange glow grew in patches, licking up the walls, smoke curling into the windows. From inside, the heat was already pressing through the wood, the hiss and pop of burning paint rising over the sound of the choir. Reverend Isaiah stood at the front, staring up at the ceiling as it groaned in protest. He could see tongues of flame sliding under the eaves, shadows dancing like devils along the rafters. The youngest members of the choir began to cry. He raised his voice above the noise, steady and deep. "Do not fear what kills the body, but what kills the spirit," he thundered. The words shook the walls more than the fire did. "They think they can burn God's house," he went on, "but his house is in us." Around him, the congregation roared their agreement, not in panic, but in unity. They weren't just singing anymore. They were declaring war the only way they knew how, through faith. Deacon Ellis had already moved to the back of the church, where the small store of gasoline for the generator was kept. "If they want fire," he said to the men beside him, "let's give 'em one they won't forget." Together they carried the canisters to the side door. The heat was fierce now. Smoke stung their eyes. Ellis cracked the door open, saw the shapes of white robes through the haze, and smiled grimly. "Move back," he muttered, striking a match. When the men outside saw the flash, it was too late. The line of fire ran straight toward them, meeting the kerosene trail they had poured themselves. The ground erupted, a wall of flame, racing along the hill, forcing them backward. Horses screamed, men fell, torches scattered. From the church doorway, Isaiah stepped forward into the glow, the firelight haloing him like a prophet in judgment. "You came with fire," he shouted over the roar, "but you met faith." His voice carried across the burning yard, swallowed and amplified by the crackle of flames. Some of the clan dropped their weapons and ran. Others froze, stunned by the sight, a black preacher standing in front of a burning church, unbroken, unbowed, his people behind him still singing. The flames reached higher, painting the sky in gold and red. Inside the sanctuary, windows burst from the heat, but the roof held. The congregation poured out into the yard, coughing, eyes watering, but alive. Together, under the rising plume of smoke, they sang the hymn again. "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah." Voices hoarse yet triumphant, their faith now burning brighter than the fire that tried to consume them. By the time the fire reached its peak, the night sky over Birmingham was no longer black, but deep red, glowing like a wound. Flames licked the clouds as the steeple of Mount Olive cracked, a rain of sparks falling onto the grass, where the congregation stood huddled together. Men from the clan staggered back toward the road, coughing, their robes singed and their courage gone. Horses bucked and screamed in the chaos, throwing riders into the mud. A few tried to reload their rifles, but the smoke was too thick. They couldn't see the church anymore, only the glare of a light that refused to die. From below the hill, townspeople who had heard the commotion began to gather, their faces lit by the glow. Some whispered, some prayed, others just watched in disbelief as the untouchable clan was driven off by the very people they came to destroy. Inside the churchyard, Reverend Isaiah moved among his people, coughing but steady. "Keep low," he told them, guiding. Women and children away from the building. His hands were blistered, his voice hoarse, yet his eyes were alive, fierce, certain. Deacon Ellis and the other men used wet cloths to beat back the smaller fires that crept toward the trees. The smell of pine resin and burned paint filled the air. Martha Hughes, one of the elders, knelt beside a boy whose sleeve had caught an ember. She tore off her shawl to smother the flame, then pressed him against her chest, whispering hymns between sobs. The heat shimmered around them, but no one fled. They formed a chain, passing buckets, stamping out sparks, refusing to abandon their house of worship even as its walls cracked. It was no longer just a building. It was the proof of their endurance. When at last the roof gave way with a terrible groan, Reverend Isaiah called out, "Step back, let it fall." The people obeyed, retreating to the far side of the yard as the steeple collapsed inward, sending a final rush of fire toward the heavens. For a long moment there was nothing but the roar of the blaze and the sound of their own breathing. Then, one by one, voices began to rise again, tired, broken, but defiant. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." It started soft, then grew stronger, louder, spreading through the crowd until even the watchers at the bottom of the hill joined in. The hymn rolled through the night, mixing with the hiss of the dying fire, climbing toward the red sky like smoke made of song. When the last flames finally sank to glowing embers, the people of Mount Olive stood in a ring around what had been their church. Soot streaked their faces, their clothes soaked and torn, but their eyes were bright. The Klan had vanished into the trees. The fire had taken the building, but it had also burned something loose in the hearts of everyone who had been there, a weight that had pressed on them for generations. In that charred yard, they felt it lift. The night had tried to silence them, but instead it had made them louder. The hill that once held a small wooden church now held something greater, a people reborn in fire and faith. When the sun rose over Birmingham that next morning, the hill looked like a battlefield. Smoke still drifted from the ruins of Mount Olive, the smell of burned wood and kerosene clinging to everything it touched. Crows circled overhead, and the soft crackle of dying embers whispered through the air. Reverend Isaiah stood barefoot in the dirt, his Bible clutched tight to his chest, its leather cover blackened at the edges. Around him, families picked through the ashes in silence, not searching for possessions, but for meaning. Ruth Turner found a half-melted cross. Old Martha lifted a scorched hymnal, its pages fused together, but the words, "Amazing Grace," were still visible on the last page. When she showed it to Isaiah, he smiled faintly. "You see," he said, "even fire can't read that out." As word spread through the city, people began to climb the hill. Some came from as far as Tuscaloosa, carrying food, blankets, buckets of water, or just the weight of their own grief. The newspapers tried to bury the story, calling it a church accident, but everyone in Birmingham knew the truth. Even a few white neighbors came quietly before dawn, their hats in their hands, shame written on their faces. They didn't speak. They only helped clear debris and left small donations on the preacher's porch. By noon, the crowd had grown so large that the hill seemed to hum with life again. Men prayed aloud, women wept openly, and somewhere among them, a child began to sing. Within minutes, hundreds of voices joined in, rising above the ruins like wings. It wasn't mourning anymore, it was declaration. Reverend Isaiah climbed what remained of the steps, the wind tugging at his soot-stained shirt. He looked out over his people, faces streaked with ash, eyes red from smoke, and tears, and lifted his Bible high. "You thought you came to burn a building," he said, his voice hoarse but strong. "But what you did was light a flame in every one of us. You can't bury that fire. You can't drown it. You can't hang it from a tree." The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in shouts of "Amen" and "Tell it, Reverend." Some dropped to their knees, others threw their hands to the sky. And as the smoke thinned and sunlight broke through, it painted the people of Mount Olive in gold, a congregation no longer afraid, a miracle born from ashes. That morning, Birmingham witnessed something the Klan would never understand. When you try to destroy faith with fire, all you do is forge saints out of survivors. By the following Sunday, the hill where Mount Olive had stood was no longer just a ruin. It had become a gathering place. People from across Birmingham came in steady streams, families who had lost their own churches to fire, laborers still in their work clothes, and maids with their aprons folded under their arms. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the blackened ground while the choir sang without walls, their voices carrying across the valley like thunder. Reporters from the Birmingham News lingered at the edge of the crowd, pencils shaking in their hands. They had come expecting fear, but what they found was resolve so fierce it made them lower their eyes. In the center of that sea of people stood Reverend Isaiah, his coat burned at the sleeves, his face weathered from the heat of the night that had tried to kill him. "You think they stopped us?" he called out. Look around. This is what faith looks like when you burn away the walls." He lifted a small cross fashioned from 2 charred beams that the deacons had salvaged. The moment he held it up, the crowd fell silent, then erupted in song. "Ain't no grave gonna hold my body down." Even the men who had sworn they'd never sing again after that night found their voices. Their children clapped, and for the first time in weeks, laughter rippled through the crowd, fragile but real. The Klan tried to answer the gathering with threats. Flyers appeared on doorsteps warning that justice was coming for Carter and his people. But something had changed. The night they burned Mount Olive, they burned away the last layer of fear that had kept the black community divided. Deacon Ellis organized watch patrols. The women took turns cooking for the men who guarded the roads. At dusk, the faint glow of lanterns dotted the hills like stars fallen to earth. When a lone rider was spotted one evening, he turned back before reaching the hill. No one fired a shot. No one had to. The message was clear. Birmingham had seen what faith could do when cornered, and the men in hoods now rode through a city that was no longer theirs to terrify. But hate never vanishes. It waits. A week after the service on the hill, a group of the same men who had fled the fire gathered again at the edge of town. Their pride had been wounded deeper than their skin. Rumors of their retreat had spread like a plague through Birmingham, and in the bars where they drank and whispered, the humiliation festered. "We'll finish it this time," Earl Jennings said, his jaw tight, his hand trembling slightly as he poured whiskey into a tin cup. The others nodded, some eager, some afraid. They told themselves it wasn't about race anymore. It was about restoring control, about making sure the Negroes remember their place. But deep down, even they knew. It was about fear. The night at Mount Olive had shown them something they couldn't explain, and that terrified them more than any man ever could. They set out after midnight again, but this time they didn't carry torches. They carried rifles. They moved through the woods quietly, headlights off, their breath frosting in the cool air. The hill came into view, faintly lit by the moon and something else. A small campfire burned near the ruins, surrounded by men from the congregation, their rifles propped against logs. They were singing softly, the same hymn that had carried them through the first attack. "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah." The sight stopped the riders cold. The sound drifted down the slope, steady, unafraid. Jennings cursed under his breath, motioning for the others to fan out. But before they could move, one of the men in the campfire circle rose. It was Deacon Ellis. He held his rifle casually, the barrel pointing toward the ground. "We know you're out there," he called into the darkness, his voice even. "You come to burn what's already ashes?" Silence followed, thick and uneasy. The Klan men shifted in their saddles, the horses stamping nervously. Ellis took another step forward, the firelight cutting across his face. "You brought guns this time," he said. "So did we. Difference is, we ain't hiding behind no masks." Then he raised his rifle, not to aim, but to lift it high above his head. The men around the fire did the same, the metal gleaming in the firelight. Behind them, the faint silhouettes of women appeared, Martha, Sarah Hughes, and others, each holding a lantern. The Klan riders didn't advance. Something in that image, the fire, the rifles, the women standing unflinching, broke whatever spell of control they still thought they had. Jennings spat in the dirt, muttered, "Let 'em rot here," and yanked his horse around. One by one the others followed, their shapes swallowed by the trees. When the sound of hooves finally faded, the men by the fire lowered their rifles. Ellis turned back toward the hilltop where the cross made from the burned beams of Mount Olive stood against the moonlight. "They'll be back," one of the younger men whispered. Ellis nodded slowly. "Maybe," he said, "but next time they'll come as men, not ghosts." And as the night wind passed over the ruins of the Church, the flames of the campfire bent toward the cross, as if the earth itself was bowing to what had been born on that hill. Not fear, not revenge, but a quiet, living power that refused to kneel again. In the weeks that followed, the hill no longer smelled of smoke. It smelled of sawdust. Hammer strikes replaced the echoes of gunfire, and the sound of lumber dragging across the ground was like a rhythm of resurrection. Every morning, men came from miles away, sharecroppers, bricklayers, even factory workers who took the day off to help rebuild what had been taken. Women brought baskets of biscuits, water jugs, and their children, who played among the ashes, chasing each other between the broken pews. The rebuilding of Mount Olive wasn't planned, it simply began, as if the entire city had made the same silent promise overnight. No one spoke of fear anymore. They spoke of when the roof would rise again. Reverend Isaiah worked alongside them, his hands blistered from carrying planks. "We build higher this time," he said, "so when the sun hits her roof, it'll be seen from every corner of Birmingham." And that's what they did. The new church grew taller than the last, with a steeple of iron instead of pine and windows of thick glass that caught the morning light like colored fire. On the front steps, they carved the words, "Faith and Fire, 1927. Every hammer swing felt like defiance. Every nail driven into the wood was a prayer nailed to history. At night, they camped near the construction site, sharing stories around a fire that burned not in fear, but in fellowship. Children fell asleep to the sound of saws and songs, dreaming under the same stars that had once watched their terror. The Klan rode by twice during those first weeks, slow, silent, their torches unlit. They didn't stop, and they didn't speak. They only looked. The men of Mount Olive stood watching them from the half-built walls, tools still in hand, and didn't flinch. They didn't have to. The sight of the church rising again was message enough. By the third week, even the riders stopped coming. Something stronger than intimidation had taken root on that hill. The people called it faith. But in truth, it was something broader, something that carried the scent of freedom. When the new Mount Olive was finished, the first service began with no invitation. People just came. They filled every pew and spilled out onto the grass. Hundreds of voices lifted into a morning sky that blazed gold over the iron steeple. Reverend Isaiah stepped to the pulpit, tears in his eyes. "They came to burn us down," he said softly, "but God used their fire to make us shine." The crowd erupted in song, louder than ever before, and from that day forward, the Klan never came back to Birmingham in daylight, because the hill of Mount Olive no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to the people who rebuilt it, and to the light that not even hate could drown. Months turned into years, and the new Mount Olive stood like a crown above Birmingham. On Sunday mornings, the iron steeple caught the sun and threw a beam of light across the valley. Travelers on the railway could spot it from miles away and whisper, "That's the church that wouldn't burn." Children grew up hearing the story the way others told fairy tales. The night when hooded men came with torches and found a wall of song instead of fear. It became part of who they were, stitched into their prayers, passed on at kitchen tables and baptisms. Every family in Southside Hollow could point to someone who had been there that night, an aunt, a father, a neighbor, and they spoke their names like a lineage of survival. Reverend Isaiah never sought fame for what happened. He refused every newspaper request, every invitation to speak in larger cities. "This ain't my story," he'd say. "It's God's, and it belongs to these people." He continued to preach in the same calm way he always had, but there was a new weight in his words. His sermons reached beyond endurance to something more dangerous: hope. He reminded them that freedom wasn't a gift, it was a duty, and courage was contagious if you let it be seen. Under his guidance, Mount Olive became more than a church. It became a meeting ground for organizers, teachers, and preachers from all over the South who wanted to learn how to resist without hate. By the late 1930s, when Birmingham began to swell with steel and smoke, the story of the church on the hill had already crossed state lines. Letters arrived from Tennessee, Georgia, even Chicago, addressed simply to the Reverend of the church that stood. People sent coins, scraps of cloth, photographs of their own burned sanctuaries, asking for prayers. Isaiah kept everyone in a wooden box beneath the altar. "We're not just keeping house for ourselves," he told his congregation one morning. "We're keeping light for those still, walking in the dark." And the people nodded, understanding that their miracle had grown larger than them. What had begun as survival had become a symbol, a beacon that told the world, when faith and fire meet, it's not the fire that wins. Decades later, long after Reverend Isaiah Carter had passed and the iron steeple had begun to rust from the Alabama rain, the story of that night still lived on the hill. The elders told it to the children as they sat on the steps after service. The smell of cornbread and pine smoke in the air. The children would listen wide-eyed as Deacon Ellis, now grey and bent, would point to the blackened patch of ground by the oak tree and whisper, "That's where the fire came. But that's also where we learned we couldn't be burned." The little ones would touch the earth with their fingers, as if feeling for the pulse of the past. And every Sunday the congregation sang a little louder, knowing their voices were echoes of the ones who had sung. Through smoke. Mount Olive changed with time. The Great Depression came and went. War pulled sons from pews and brought them home with medals and scars. The civil rights movement swept through Birmingham, and when the marches began downtown, the first place they gathered to pray was still that hill. Young ministers came, carrying the same conviction that Isaiah had preached. Faith is not silence, it's standing when the world tells you to kneel. The old church became a refuge again, not from flames this time, but from tear gas and police batons. And when they were beaten and jailed, they returned to that hill, heads held high, their courage fed by the story that had made them who they were. On quiet nights, when the wind moved through the steeple, and the choir's faint notes drifted over Birmingham, it was said you could still hear the echoes of that first fire, the singing that refused to stop, the voices that rose above the hate. The Klan had vanished into history, books, but the song endured. Mount Olive remained more than a church. It was a monument carved not from stone but from endurance. The fire that had once threatened to destroy it had become its light. And in every corner of America where people still faced hate, the legend of that night was whispered again and again. They came with fire to destroy faith, but met a faith made of fire.